Welcome, Catherine. So Lance is our board chair, and I'm the executive director of Perisound Muskoka Community Network. Could you give us a bit of a background before you moved to Bracebridge, sort of set the scene of your life and how you got to Bracebridge, and then we'll talk about the journey of having won the award subsequently.
So I have always wanted to be an entrepreneur since I was a really young kid. And I started my entrepreneurial journey, making my way from Mississauga into Toronto, started a small software company there, ended up selling it to a big Irish company based out of Shenzhen, China, and got to travel the world, got to meet incredibly smart people working on hard technology problems. And I got a little bit jaded. I couldn't really understand why so many smart people were working on what I considered technology for technology's sake. So not really solving a problem, but kind of just, connecting the next thing to the internet. And I really wanted to make sure that whatever I did next started with a problem and then let the technology or the solution come second. And around the same time, my husband and I were really looking for just a change of pace in our life. And I grew up going to a cottage in Quebec, in the Laurentians. And I had this sort of dream of not just getting, access to a cottage after I've retired and I'm sort of, don't have that many years to enjoy it. I want to enjoy a cottage as long as I possibly could. So we bought a place, and I think I was about 26 at the time in Port Carling. And we thought it was going to be somewhere we went on the weekends, and we got up there and we just didn't leave. It became home really, really quickly, just fell in love. And I decided that's where I wanted to start my next company. And it was really a dream for me to be able to do that up in Port Carling. And I think we had underestimated a little bit the logistical challenges of having a physical products business that needed to get things to airports to be able to get them to customers. I very quickly found myself driving, 2 hours to Toronto to drop off a shipment and 2 hours back kind of every day because it was a little bit challenging. We needed more specialized technicians than I think we thought we did in the beginning. We thought everything was fast trainable, but it turned out that knitting, which is a really core part of what we do, is really a legacy trade that very few people in the world know. If they know it, they're in North Carolina, they're in Italy, or they're in Montreal. And the number of flights, the amount of driving that we were doing was really pulling us to Montreal. And I'd say it was probably one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make, which was to ultimately, move closer to an airport, move closer to knitting technicians, because I think that there is so much potential and like a better life to be had to building a company in Muskoka. And I think that if I were to think about, what could have made us stay, how could we have made that work? I think it would have been, how do we have better transport? How do we have better arteries between Muskoka and Toronto and other airports, so that we can make that easier on small businesses? I think another part of it is, how do we have more housing in Muskoka so that we can actually relocate people to Muskoka and make that, an easy and attractive process? It's a beautiful place to be. How do you make that something that you can really do? So I'm a huge advocate for how do we sort of build this infrastructure in Muskoka to make this easier for the next company that wants to do what we're doing, because I think that if we can make it work, it's an incredible dream.
Awesome. So can we dive a bit more deeply into the transition from your first company, which was software, to Sheertex, which is, what was the right? It's a garment business, I guess we'd call it. And how was it, because Lance in his career built a very successful technology company. He didn't go on then to go into the clothing business. So
no,
help
I'm
us
most
understand what it
interested in
takes.
the answer to this one.
Yeah. So my very first job out of university was at a company called Ecobee. They make smart thermostats.
Yes.
So I was very much thrown into the world of physical products, not necessarily apparel, but consumer electronics, manufacturing, direct-to-consumer sales. And I loved that. I loved being able to hold the product that you make. I loved being able to change something in someone's physical environment. And the company that I ended up starting, which was called ShopLocket, was an e-commerce platform. So most of my customers were also making products. So I had customers making sous vides and watches and rings and kind of you name it. And one of the things that I would do is I would try to help them, because they're mostly very early stage, figure out how do we make your product? How do we make it cheaper? How do we make this succeed? And I was helping people on Kickstarter and finding factories, and got myself to travel to a bunch of factories globally to figure out how our customers could, get to market faster. So I've always had this thread of physical products and direct to consumer, sales that was really part of my experiences. And in that, I ended up selling that company to this large manufacturing company that, while they were doing mostly electronic products, they were still, at the end of the day, products that solved problems or wanted to solve problems, whether they did it or not. And because I'd become so jaded by connected to the internet products, I really wanted to explore, can there be other forms of technology that aren't just connected to the internet? And I think that, if you go back 30, 40 years, technology was materials, technology was, building semiconductors, technology was mechanical, it was electronic, it was all of these different things. And we've kind of boiled it down in the last 20 years to being, it's building a website and, having SaaS. And I think that I really wanted to go back to the first principles of technology solving problems and using various types of technology. So at Sheertex, we started with basically chemicals and mechanical technology to solve a very seemingly basic problem, which is really strong tights. And now we've gone even deeper into polymer science, into the actual mechanical structure of a knit. We build software now that runs all of our factories. So we've taken a very holistic approach to how to use technology to change an industry. But I guess it feels more natural to me than it probably looks. But certainly I was not coming at this from, I want to start an apparel business. It was, I want to solve a problem, and I'm open to lots of different technologies. In fact, I'm almost biased away from software in some ways.
So, Lance, do you have a follow-up question for that?
No, it's a lot of admiration, I guess, for what you're doing. It's I do see a lot of what you're talking about, technology chasing technology. And while it's neat like a video game is neat, But yeah, getting back to first principles, and I think there's so much that can be done there. And just even looking at, in your case, where you've looked at a traditional industry and go back to first principles and then reimagine it. And I think there's still a lot of opportunity out there for that kind of approach. So I see a lot of similarities with even Mr. Musk and Tesla, reimagining a traditional industry and then coming up with a whole different approach. So, but Stuart, I'll let you carry on. You have lots of questions.
Yeah. So, Catherine, if in terms of the first business and starting the second business, how is that similar or different for you? Were you did you have the first time around you had no investors, the second time you did, or you had access to an accelerator or a university in the first time, or not the second? How is it? Did you have a cookie cutter formula of people to help you from the first time, or did you have to start or go in a different direction the second time around?
Yeah, so I would say that the first business that I did was definitely not the first business that I incorporated. It was the first business worth talking about. And I probably started, maybe 4 or 5 different projects or companies or things before that. And then that company did go through an accelerator. It also got rejected by lots of accelerators. It did raise venture capital, about $1 million, also got rejected by lots of venture capitalists. And it only got up to about 12 employees at its height. So, a little bit of, learning to run a business and payroll and revenue and P&L. But I would say it was, very much training wheels. It was not... I thought it was, big time at the time, but it was a smaller scale than what I'm doing on almost every level. And I think that that's natural. I think it's natural that in life we, have to try a few different times, and you get to one level here and then you get to another level and the next thing and the next thing. And I hope in my career I can look back on where Sheertex is today and think, oh, that was the small times. And, there's tens of thousands of employees, and, it's a completely different ballgame. But obviously where we're at today, we're about 200 employees, and hopefully we'll be at around 300,000 to 400,000 square feet of space and millions of units in the next couple days. Like, that's big for me. It's a huge step for me in my career in learning to manage a team. But in the relative scale of business, it's also pretty small. So I think that life should be about finding harder and harder challenges and trying to rise to that occasion.
So why didn't you, after the first time or the first couple of times when it didn't work out, why didn't you just go get a job? What keeps you trying, even though that the first few didn't go as well? How did you get out of the bed in the morning going, oh, shucks, that didn't work. I got to try something else?
Yeah, I think that I love the game. I love the fight. And I like to be able to have an idea and try to run at it as fast as I possibly can. And in a corporate environment, and I'll admit I haven't spent that much time in a corporate environment, just my acquisitions and a few jobs that I had before this, it was fine. But I think that I wanted to move faster than everyone else was moving. I wanted to take more risk. I wanted to get bigger. I wanted to swing for the fences. And I think that I felt very constrained in those types of environments. And I, would rather be broken failing, but trying a million times over than to just wake up and not feel like I was trying to play in the big leagues. And I think there's this, like, the highs are high, which is amazing. The lows are low, but you really get to kind of feel that whole spectrum of life and human emotion, and, real pride when it works and real accountability when it doesn't.
Turning now to competitions. Why did you enter Founders Circle? What awards? And you've recently won a $1 million award for something down in the States. I mean, why do you enter these competitions? What's the sort of logic behind it? Where's the going through all the hoops of doing that? What's the payback for you in terms of, is it just media coverage, or how do you look at the competitions you take on?
There's a quote from a partner at Y Combinator, Dalton, and he says that in startups, you want to create the biggest possible surface area for luck. It's about doing lots and lots and lots of things. You don't know which ones are going to work, but can you create the most possible surface area that the company can, get lucky? And I think that means a whole bunch of different things, but basically I feel like whether it's a competition, whether it's a coffee meeting, whether it's an event I'm speaking at, whether it's saying yes to a random trip that I don't know who I'm going to meet, I think that if you create all of those possible points of connection, possible points of opportunity, sure, 99% of them might lead nowhere, right? Like, you could either, win the competition, but it doesn't matter, or you could meet someone that changes the trajectory of the business. And I've just found it so many times in, all of my experience in all the businesses, you end up looking back and you connect the dots and you're like, wow, if I didn't do that, I never would have gotten this opportunity where I am right now. And that thing at the time might have seemed totally insignificant, but it was what ended up opening the door. So I'm a huge believer in putting yourself out there, and nothing is really a waste of time, because you actually do have to waste a little bit of time in order to find those things that are magical. Because if you just say no to everything, you're never going to find it.
Let's move now to having won the award, and then having to go, oh shucks, I can't find a building big enough in Muskoka. I can't find enough employees. I've got to move. How take us through that story, because that move to Montreal must have been an interesting adventure or transition that happened within months, not years.
Yeah, it all happened so fast. It felt like forever at the time, but it was in an actual timeline very fast. So we opened our factory in Bracebridge in October, and we were shipping our first units by February. We scaled from zero revenue to $250,000 a month US in 4 months. We had months of back orders. We were trying to hire, we were trying to scale. And it just by June, the number of back orders, the lack of like the number of trips to Montreal, it was just crushing. Like we just couldn't do it. And our thought was, okay, can we just like expand quickly? Like, what does that look like? And talk to our landlords, and it's okay, well, it's going to be, 12 to 18 months to build out. And then, okay, well, we need a dye house here. Okay, well, like the permitting is much, much harder in Muskoka to get a dye house because of obviously all the environmental regulations. And so you might not do that. So you're still going to have to get all your dyeing done in Montreal. And it was just sort of like becoming really clear that this was going to be really freaking hard. And then we went to Montreal to purchase some machines. And the building that we were purchasing the machines from, they're like, oh, by the way, like everything's for sale, we're leaving. And they had actually at the time laid off about 200 employees in that facility because they were moving everything overseas. And it was one of these moments that like, you're doing harm by leaving one place, but you're doing good if you go to the other place. We were able to bring back many of the employees that had been laid off in this new facility back to work, keep this facility, which has been a hosiery factory since the 1950s, still operating as a hosiery factory as the market kind of crashes here in Montreal. And it was really one of these, conversations on trade-offs, like what does this look like in terms of upside? What's the amount of good that the company can do overall? And do we do it? And then can we find the capital to do it? And at the same time, we had to then raise the capital to be able to make the move to Montreal. But that's a little bit more sort of insight into sort of how that went.
What was the rationale between going to Montreal as opposed to going to some factory in China?
So we had made the decision very early on for IP protection reasons, for speed reasons, that we wanted to make our own product. So we knew we wanted to do it ourselves. So the only actual question was Montreal or like North Carolina. And obviously being Canadian and having good taste in food, we chose Montreal.
North Carolina. Well, good for you.
So, Catherine, when you originally came out with your Sheertex stockings, the way I used to describe it to people, it's almost like you used materials like Kevlar or something, bulletproof type materials to make the very strong stockings. And often people say to me, but it'll never work because nobody wears stockings. Who's buying stockings, and why is it work?
Yeah, well, there's billions of pairs of tights that are sold every year. And you think of a climate like Canada, like there's 6 months a year that to wear a dress without tights would be really chilly. So there's a very practical application for tights. And, what we're trying to do is take something that was a disposable category, like quite like a plastic water bottle, and turn it into something that's more like socks or underwear that you can, know it's going to actually make it through the day. And that's really what we've been able to do with our clients.
So if we switch now to this conference that we have been asked to be involved with, which is a panel. So this conference is asking us to talk about our ecosystem here. And our mandate with Parry Sound Muskoka covers Parry Sound and Muskoka. And we're a federal funded organization to try and support businesses. And we have been asked because we seem to be doing some very different things like Founders Circle and these impact galas. And we've had our tourism agency manage to persuade Porter Air to, operate out of our airport. Yeah. And yet we don't seem to have a lot of the infrastructure big cities have to support business. So I appreciate any insights you have that we could share with others at this conference. These are people in the entrepreneurial space and academics from around the world looking for ideas for entrepreneurship. And perhaps if you could frame it in terms of maybe some of the things we are doing okay, but some of the things we could really do to take our rural areas to a new level to make it a lot easier for businesses from your perspective.
Yeah, so I think it kind of goes back to some of those things I said earlier around making it easier for logistics. I think that's a huge part of it, particularly as you see, so many more businesses going direct to consumer and going, into e-commerce. I think the logistics connection is just not there. Also, flights are really important. If I could have flown direct from Muskoka to Montreal, like this might have been a different story, but the 7-hour drive or the drive to Toronto and then the flight from Toronto, like that made it very difficult. Even fast rail would have been, a great way to do it. But like logistics, whether that's people logistics or logistics of product, was a really big challenge for us. And then I'd say that, affordable housing was a huge problem as well. Because even if we could convince someone to come, the only way they could actually even start working with us was to buy a house, which is a really big commitment. And it's a really big thing to be like, take this job and buy a house, like on the same day. That's huge for someone. And we had people living in hotels for months, just so that they could continue working for us. And there was also like, there's no taxis. So if they were staying in a hotel, they couldn't even get to work. So it was just like all of these things kind of piling up. And then, to bring up the permitting as well, like I've heard stories of some businesses that in Canada, it was so hard for them to get permits. They ended up going to the US, partnering with a city, and the city was like, I will have a permit officer on site so that you can get your permits fast, so that we can get your build going. And like, that's just one example of what a city can do to make sure that they're making it easy for the business. But, whether it was our dye houses, whether it was a build, that was really challenging. Also, for an early stage business, getting capital is hard. Like in a city like Bracebridge, where there are no buildings we can just rent, and we have to basically buy and build our own building in order to operate there, we didn't have the capital. So it's easier to go to a city where you can just rent. But so this is probably a long list, but those are the kind of things that really became structural barriers for us. I'll also add another kind of weird one, but like in Montreal, people can take transit. In Montreal, the roads are cleared and the snow is actually taken off the road. And it's like, it's a machine to make sure that people can get to work. The number of days we had to cancel work due to snowfall and people not being able to actually get into work was huge. Like I would say that in February, we only operated one February, there was at least a week in that February that most people couldn't get to work. And so it's all of these little things that end up adding up. And, this isn't even talking about having the skilled labor force already there. This is just other things beyond that.
Can we turn now to COVID? How did you get through COVID? It's hit so many smaller businesses in very unique ways, and as a part of what you went through with that, but were there things that you could share with others that perhaps if we ever have another crisis like that, they could learn from the things that you did to navigate through COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, it took us a little bit of stubbornness to be able to get through it. Just like everything was really up against us, from being in manufacturing to being in a market that was very suppressed during COVID, and we just kind of refused to die. It was about how do we be extremely creative? How do we adopt new channels? How do we meet the customer where they are? And I think just not letting the external factors get to you, really focusing on having an internal locus of control and saying like, what can I control? What can I do? Rather than saying like, oh, it's just not going to work because of all of these external factors. And I think that's what we did. And, we just were like, we wanted to grow 100% year over year. We're going to do it anyway. And how are we going to do that? And that's really how we approached it.
I want to be respectful of your time to finish within the half an hour, but have you kept your cottage? How's this impacted you personally in terms of all these changes, and how are you coping, when you don't have your business hat on and being able to do the personal fun stuff?
I'm still an Ontario resident. I still, like, our primary residence is still in Port Carling. We're there every chance we can. It's just that the core of the business and, a lot of our time now has to be in Montreal.
And any advice for coping with, spouses and or, extended family issues that having to make a move and having to do this, big transition? Were there things that you had to figure out to cope with that you can give other young entrepreneurs advice that if they've got to deal with other family and these kind of transitions, any tips and thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the best advice. What I ended up doing was bringing my husband into the business. He's now the president of the company, and we really made the move together.
And then the final one, is there anything we haven't asked you that you would be keen to share with us, something that we could learn from or underline or take as a sort of final thoughts or comments for us?
I think the only other thing I would say is that, to anyone that's out there trying to start a business, good on you. It's not easy, but it's I think one of the biggest self-growth learning experiences that you can take on. I think you'll really feel, all the highs and all the lows, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
Catherine, thank you. Our time is up, unfortunately, way too short a time, but we really appreciate you taking this time and being kind enough to let us share your thoughts and insights and your journey with the rest of our group at the Impact Gala. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.